Greetings. Welcome. Who cares? You know the channel, Player Politics. Today, we're gonna file this one under neither, actually. Technically politics, but not really. Uh, I kind of want to take us back. I want to take us back a long way. Because, in the last video, I spoke about gun control and what gun control means. And I feel like we got off on the wrong foot. I think we need to go back and really establish a couple of things. And by that I mean we need to go over the Second Amendment itself. And I say this because I believe the Second Amendment is cruelly misinterpreted. I believe that because people don't have a genuine or fundamental understanding of exactly what it was intended for, that people don't have an understanding of how that translates to today, because the language is different, people spoke differently, but we can read it and understand what they meant if we used our brains. That little thing up here, if we used it, we can get there. So I kind of want to take a minute and just kind of talk about what the Second Amendment is, how the Second Amendment came to be, and what it means for us today. All right. So all 10 amendments that we now know as the Bill of Rights they were originally supposed to be just addendums added to the Constitution. That was originally how they were going to be conceived. The majority of the first 10 amendments that would become the Bill of Rights were submitted by James Madison. James Madison was a Federalist who believed that first and foremost, having the power vested to the federal government and then enumerated to the states was a better solution than to start at the states and then go up to the federal level, meaning that the federal government should have the last say, but not the first say. That states organize behind the government, right? As a good example, let's use criminality as an example, right? Now, let's say the federal government says that the mandatory sentence for a murderer is 5 years. Now, that's federal mandate. The state can say, well, we want to punish them for 7 years. They can do that, but they can't say, well, we only want to punish them for 4 years. That's the difference. That's how the state rights versus the federal rights works. Okay. And now this is important because the Constitution is designed to enumerate and regulate the function of the government. The idea being that the government cannot do more than what is established by the Constitution. It regulates its powers, it explains their function, their responsibilities. And so when the Constitution, during the Constitutional Convention, there were a whole lot of discussions about what would and what wouldn't be in it, how certain things were going to be handled, how rights were to be handled, how states' rights were to be handled, how individual rights were to be handled. As a reference point, the 10th Amendment was written basically to remind the government that rights not specifically explained in the Bill of Rights default to the people. Meaning, if, for example, the right to peaceably protest, if there wasn't specifically a right to do that enumerated in the Bill of Rights or the Constitution, that the default stance is that the people have the right to do it. And because of that, the government understands that it cannot arbitrarily say, well, you cannot protest, and you don't have they can't say you don't have a case because it's not in the Constitution. That was never its intent. The intention of the Constitution was to regulate the government and to regulate the total presence of the government. Now, how that relates to the Second Amendment and why it's such a contentious issue, you need to understand first the motivations. As I said, originally the Bill of Rights, or what would become the Bill of Rights, were things that were supposed to be amendments or addendums into the Constitution itself. This is because several people, James Madison among them, believed that if you ratified the Constitution first and then amended the Constitution, that all the amendments would do is simply stipulate what the government can take away. Like he didn't believe that the rights granted under the amendments would be substantive. They wouldn't serve to protect the people, and he was concerned that if you could amend the Constitution, that you could limit the Constitution in a way that it was unfavorable to the protection of the people. He actually referred to it as a parchment barrier. He eventually came around from this after speaking with several statists or anti-federalists, and after some consideration. Uh, Actually, he part of what he did was he went back and looked over numerous historical governmental documents from other countries. Back then, I think 18 or 20 countries had what was called the right to bear arms. Most famous of which was was England, that gave the right to bear arms to Protestants of Ireland. It was actually limited specifically to Protestants, but what it did was it prescribed that the Protestants could maintain arms for the purposes of defense, and that right could not be regulated by the Queen or mitigated by the Queen. And there were some other such rights. Most of those countries have stripped away that right. I believe only Brazil, Mexico, and the United States actually have what amounts to their version of a constitutional right to bear arms, and we are the freest of them. We don't have any stipulations for how you may obtain that right. It is simply a natural right. So I'm going to look over here real quick because I have it written down. It's very important that it's known. Okay. Well, when the first list of amendments were proposed, he was the first one to lay them out. Basically, 8 out of the 10 amendments. Regarding the Second Amendment, and it's funny because if you look at the Bill of Rights, it starts off by saying a well-armed and regulated militia being necessary for the security of the state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. When James Madison originally wrote that, he originally started the sentence. He started the right with the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Nothing came before it. That was the first sentence, and he was trying to make a point. His suggestion was that the base principle before anything else was that the citizen could keep and bear arms. Now, what do they mean by well-armed and regulated militia? An organized and regulated militia. Well, they're not talking about the U.S. military. That is a function of the government, or that is a product of the government for sovereign protection. What they're talking about specifically is the right of the people to form militias. And this is an important distinction. And how do I explain this? Okay, so right now you have the all-volunteer military, right? Because there's no conscription. That's been outlawed as well. That was laid out in the Bill of Rights as something that cannot be done. The point was that the citizen should always be allowed to keep to have those firearms in their house. More importantly, there is language that suggests that the allowable weapons must be not necessarily equal, but within a certain efficacy of military weapons, okay? Which is part of why we have the AR-15. It is the only closest thing we have to the standard rifle, to the standard military rifle provided by United States military, right? Currently it's the M4, previously it was the M16A4, and right, it is a very accurate weapon, just like AR-15s are very accurate weapons. But the whole point was, and Madison firmly believed this, Madison firmly believed that if the citizenry could not arm themselves, that they would have no chance, right? Because there would always be militias. Oftentimes the people would just live as regular citizens, going about their day to day. But if one day the government decided to turn tyranny, decided to become oppressive, then for the first two things they would do is they would try to strip all rights from the people. Because, for example, a well-armed and well-organized people are not going to be oppressed, but a disarmed population is an easily controlled population. Now, if the people have a right to bear arms, then that means they can organize their own militias because they will not be dependent upon the government to protect them from the government that is oppressing them, which would be one and the same thing. Now, if you regulate and or overregulate the Second Amendment, now you're getting into the government having the capacity to control your ability to defend yourself from that very government. And that is a very bad thing. And they will never come right out and say, we want to take your guns. Well, some of them do, but most of them never will. They'll be subtle about it. But it is devastating. And the end goal is to confiscate weapons. If they want to control the Second Amendment, their end goal is to take weapons. And if you don't believe me, talk to the smokers. As somebody who has quit smoking, I'm not advocating smoking at all. And I'm not suggesting that it's a good thing. But it serves as an excellent example of what happens when the government is allowed to encroach ever so slowly. Most people don't know, as little as 30 years ago, you could smoke anywhere. Anywhere. You go into a restaurant, you go into the office building, in your house, on the train, on the bus. I think basically everywhere except the library. Maybe even the library too. But you could smoke anywhere, right? I've talked about it before. I think I talked about it once before. In Florida, when I would go visit Florida, had Publix, and Publix, their carts had built-in ashtrays. And I'm pretty sure other stores did, but they're not as memorable because none of them have. But even a couple years ago when I was in Florida, they still had the ashtrays in them, or the place where the ashtray would go. So it's like my mental note. So I'm not talking badly about Publix, but anyways, I'm getting beside the point. So, but then the government came knocking on the door of private businesses and says, hey, we think smoking is bad, and we'd like for the non-smokers to not have to suffer through the smokers. So can you segregate them? And the companies were like, okay, they asked the smokers, we'd like to put you in a smoking section, a section just for you guys. The service would be the same, nothing will change. We just would like our non-smoking customers to not be affected by your smoking. And the smokers, not wanting to cause a scene, obliged. And thus you had the smoking section and the non-smoking section. And all was well. Until the government came knocking again. And said, well, there's a lot more non-smokers than smokers. You don't really need that space. Would you mind going over to this section? And for most restaurants that have bars, they would limit smoking to the bar section. And the smokers, again, because we're not mean people, were like, okay, I suppose. And they were begrudging about it, but they did. And then all was well. Until the government came knocking again and said, you need to smoke outside. The private businesses said, well, don't worry, we'll provide a canopy and a heater. You'll be okay, nothing affected, and you'll still be allowed to do your thing. And the smokers, dragging their feet, were like, fine. And then the government came knocking again. You need to be 50 feet away from this building. Also, you're not allowed to smoke out in public in some places. And now the smokers had nowhere left. And they had no argument because they had allowed the incremental encroachment. You don't think they'd do that with the Second Amendment if they could? We must not ever give an inch on the Second Amendment, because as soon as you do, it provides the slippery slope. And maybe the current government doesn't want to do that. Maybe that's not their case. It doesn't matter. There may be a government that will. Right? There's a famous saying, we are never more than one generation from a tyrannical government, from a tyrannical oppressive government. Never more than one generation. That Bill of Rights, that Second Amendment, that First Amendment, that's what keeps us a free constitutional republic. And if you let that go, they will never give it back. The government has never ceded anything that it has taken. You might be thinking, well, that can't be true. Talk to the Native Americans. Yeah. Talk to the people who have been thrown off their land. American settlers that have been thrown off their lands. Did you know that the Midwest, 70% of it is owned by the government? Bet you didn't know that. They don't give back. Now, it's not to say that there aren't measures that we can take for the sake of legitimate public good. I think it's still part of the slippery slope, but I think at some point, I think there are some things that you have to do because there is a greater public good aspect. Um, I support the 1986 automatic weapons ban. And I'll tell you why. Because this is a very controversial distinction. Very controversial distinction. Because you might be saying, well, if it's the Second Amendment protects our right to have guns, why can't we have automatic weapons? And it's because honestly, because of efficacy and general safety. And what do I mean by that? During the Vietnam War, we had the M16A1. It had 3 settings: safe, single shot, automatic fire. Okay? Now, we already had the M60 machine gun. We had the vehicle mounted machine guns. We had the 50 cal machine guns. We already had machine guns. The M16 in full auto has 0 accuracy. I think I think the reports that they actually hurt more American soldiers than killed Viet Cong. There's something like 100,000 rounds, it's like 1 or 10,000 rounds spent for each one Viet Cong killed. Not only is that a massive waste of lead, that is a massive inaccurate and massive inefficiency. So because of that, it's one of those lessons learned. The military said no longer are we going to have these rifles automatic. There is no reason, even in war. And if you're going to tell me that even in war, a shoulder fireable weapon being automatic is unnecessary, then I think you can make a legitimate case that it does not need to be for civilians. I think Uzis have no purpose in the world. They serve 0 purpose. A handheld pistol-like automatic submachine gun is unnecessary. It serves no practical purpose in combat or otherwise because it has no safe, viable function. It's just going to spray everywhere. I support the universal. I'm sorry. I support universal background checks. As a result of supporting universal background checks, I also support the banning of weapon sales at gun shows outside of gun shows where background checks can be performed. And this is important because it's about intellectual consistency and intellectual honesty. I cannot say that I am for universal background checks and then say, well, except you can sell them at gun shows, because it would be entirely inconsistent. I actually, for the most part, believe that it is acceptable to limit sales to federally licensed firearms dealers. Now, that may seem antithetical, since the whole idea is if the government can control where firearms are sold, and they control when they're sold, and thus they can shut those places down, and that is a risk. However, I feel it's a rare case where the legal benefit outweighs the risk. Not to mention, those firearms dealers will have the ability to go against the government. They only require that for an initial permit. They can still stand against the government, and they can still rise up against and support a rebel movement. And they will still get the weapons. I guarantee you, arms manufacturers will still supply weapons to civilians. That'll happen. So that's a positive. I'm sorry if I seem a little distracted. It's a little bit late. One of the other things I support is after due process and after due process and proper documenting and reporting by the state, that certain individuals should be forbidden from having firearms. There should be a process in place to restrict those people's rights. There should also be a system to reinstate those rights should they prove that they've improved themselves. Um, some examples of people whom I believe are deserving of having their rights restricted would be felons, domestic abusers, drug dealers, drug users, people who are mentally ill, people who are who have a history of violent behavior, and yeah, I firmly believe that those people, or those who have a long, detailed history of questionable behavior, and that's a harder one. That's a case where I believe that the firearms can be temporarily removed, and then they have an opportunity to prove that they are of sane mind and body, and then get those weapons back. Um, the Parkland shooter was somebody who never should have had access or the ability to buy a weapon. He was known to law enforcement before he went into the store and bought it. We know this now. And there was Parkland County Sheriffs should have put his name in the database. He should have been reported up, and he should have been not. His name. He should have been red flagged from passing a background check. I should probably clarify all of this. So, in this case, there was a long process, or there was a long list. His house was being visited repeatedly. He was being suspended and disciplined for his violent behavior. He had a public profile of questionable and disturbing imagery and stories. He self-professed to wanting to be a professional shooter. He was basically wanting to be the next Columbiner. He didn't hide any of this. And you mean to tell me that the government was incapable of determining his threat level? I believe that his name should have been red flagged, at least while an investigation was being done. And this is something that is important too. I don't think it is necessarily inappropriate if a person is being lawfully investigated to have their right to firearms restricted, pending the outcome. This idiot, Senator Flake, wanting to have this no-fly, no-buy. People will think, oh, well, that makes perfect sense, right? If you're on the no-fly list, you're obviously a threat, and so you shouldn't be able to buy guns. Except that there is no due process for being put on the no-fly list. The government can put you on there without even notifying you. That violates at least 3 separate due process clauses. And if getting put on that list is also going to strip you of your Second Amendment rights, then you cannot have that in a system that is not built on due process and checks and balances. That is a gross overreach of governmental power. A gross overreach of governmental power. Now, because of all this, and because I believe it, because I believe in the background checks, and I believe in the controlled expression of these rights, I also believe they need to upgrade the system. I think an update and upgrade to the system is long overdue. It's slow, it backlogs, information is not properly collated. I believe that there needs to be a single universal reporting system, right? Like every state for the country needs to have basically the same sheet of paper or the same site or form with the same questions that report to the same categories into a federal system that recognizes that form. So that way what you get is, when the system has to check, it can check, okay, name, matches social, this, red flag, boom, done. Instead of this form goes to this, and then this goes to this process goes to this process goes over here and starts this process, and then it loops back to the federal background system. And then, oh, okay, well, it'll be approved, but it needs to go here too. It needs to be a single system, and I believe we can do it. I don't trust the government to do that site because, well, we all remember Obamacare. 7.5, no, it was more than that. I think it was like 10 or 20 million right off the bat for the Obamacare website. And some Canadian programmer did it for $1 million and made it better. Don't trust the government to do that. I know I'm not playing as much. When I have to think, I stop playing the game. So yeah, it needs to be fixed. And I think if we can do those things, I think if we can fix the system, I think if we can ensure that when that system is fixed and that when it's done, that we actually follow it. Because that's the other thing, and it's not on my list. It's just another thing. There's no point in having laws. There's no point in having restrictions. There's no point in having any of this if the people aren't doing their job. If the police station, if the police officers and the federal and the FBI had properly followed procedure and mandate, Parkland would have never happened. Virginia Tech wouldn't have happened. And I hate bringing up those examples, but it's true. Think about, what good is it to say this person has this problem and thus they cannot own a gun if we then turn around and say, oh well, I didn't turn in the paperwork, I didn't think the threat was credible. That can't be the case, you know? And I can be okay with the regulation of rights so long as it doesn't become the stifling of rights. And I always worry, whenever the subject comes up, I always worry about when we transition from regulating to restricting to stifling. Because it doesn't take much. It doesn't take much. And we will be in a very bad place if we do. If we get to that point, we will be in a very bad place, because once we lose that, it's gone. We lose the Second Amendment, we lose the First Amendment, they are gone. They won't be back. And I think that's important. I think it's important for people to understand that that is the end game. I don't want my rights to be taken because of somebody else. And I don't want the government telling me how I can protect myself. I don't see the complication there. And it's why you should not give an inch on the Second Amendment. That first inch that you give is the only inch you need to give them, and they will dig and they will dig and they will make it larger and larger, and they won't stop. It may not be this government, but the next government, if that hole's there, then any future representative coming in or any future governmental body coming in can start chipping away at it more, because now they have an in. You cannot give them a point of weakness for them to focus on, because that is how it crumbles. That is how everything always crumbles, is finding that single point of weakness. And sometimes that point of weakness is stupid people. Stupid people who want to tell us how to exercise our rights. No, thank you. I think that about covers my rant today. But I want you to think about it. Think about the history of the Second Amendment. Think about what it took to get us the Second Amendment. Think about what James Madison was thinking when he believed that the citizens should always be able to arm themselves and organize into a militia with those firearms. And what it would mean if the government is able to strip that right from them. Pretty scary, isn't it?